I'm going to read a passage of Scripture and then Andrew is going to share with us. So this is from Matthew chapter 11, verse 1, starting at verse 1 through to verse 19. And I'm reading from the NIV version if you want to follow along. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who's to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what do you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in the king's palace. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, 'I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly I tell you, among those born of woman, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subjected to violence, and violent people have been raiding it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you're willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Whoever has ears, let them hear. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds."
Good morning. This series, A Christ-like God, asks, what does Jesus show us of God, and what updates in our narratives about God might we make? Our title is The Otherness and Wildness of God, so it makes sense to maybe describe a little bit the territory here about otherness and wildness. So, sorry, just noticing someone signed up for the Ceilidh. Thank you, whoever you are. So first up, a story and some helpful quotes and a poem. If I can share an experience of being on the number 33 bus recently. I got on just along from Waterstones in the west end of Princess Street. The bus is absolutely heaving. I managed to find a space and squeeze it in next to a middle-aged woman. And of course, as it happens, over a period of time, the bus starts shedding its people, and spaces appear. And I think it just feels a bit impolite for me to move. I'm not saying we bonded, but difficult to when you didn't actually speak. But at one point, she suddenly gets up and asks to be let out. And I thought she's going to get off the bus. But believe me, what she did was she got out and then sat in the seat behind us. So I thought, other is two-way. And I am the other here, which is fair enough, I guess. There is another world of choices, of autonomy beyond me. Have slide 2, please. Thank you. Psalm 97 verse 2 says, "Clouds and thick darkness surround him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne." John 1:18 reads, "No one has ever seen God." No one has ever seen God. But the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. There is in this sense that God is other, different, and God is wild. We have clouds and we have dark, thick darkness, in fact. There is then this distinction, there's a differentiation. We might think of creator and created. We might think of beloved and a lover. They're not the same. Put simply, God is separate and free. Yet, as we know, he is all about union. We may withdraw or separate as a response to other, to difference. Or we might walk towards other due to, say, curiosity or openness. One is a movement towards, one is a movement away. With God, both are choices and both are respected. It's best summarized, I think, with 2 quotes, which I'll probably repeat a couple of times. The first is this: "There is an otherness that draws us into union and likeness, an otherness that doesn't separate or withdraw." The other one's by Walter Brueggemann, who appears from time to time, so to speak. We live our lives before the wild, dangerous, unfettered, and free character of the living God. Like a family encased in the shell of a car, which rushes past enticing billboards that signpost interesting sights down side roads en route to a single-minded destination. If you read Bill Bryson and his early childhood holidays, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. Imagine on the left, we pass the Gilmore Freely Enneagram personality types billboard. Whoosh. And imagine on the right, we pass the community and being with others of different dispositions and persuasions billboard. Whoosh. Both give us the experience of other and wild. Both may be thrilling, opening, and surprising. Now, to get a bit more of an emotional, maybe visceral feel for other and wild, let me draw on what is a common experience for many, and that is some of our interactions with animals. Allow me one detour as we press headlong towards Matthew 11. So this is an experience or an illustration of welcoming the other, welcoming wildness that causes us to open up and blossom. James Wright is an American, is a veteran army. He's a veteran of the army veteran, that's it, sorry. He had a troubled life, and he tells a story of driving along a highway with a friend towards, Rochester, that says. He turns off towards a field, and it seems like they've been here before. This is called A Blessing by James Wright. Just off the highway to Rochester, Minnesota, twilight bounds softly forth on the grass, and the eyes of those 2 Indian ponies darken with kindness. They have come gladly out of the willows to welcome my friend and me. We step over the barbed wire into the pasture where they've been grazing all day alone. They ripple tensely they can hardly contain their happiness that we've come. They bow shyly as wet swans. They love each other. There's no loneliness like theirs. At home, once more, they begin munching the young tufts of spring in the darkness. I would like to hold the slenderer one in my arms, for she's walked over to me and nuzzled my left hand. She's black and white. Her mane falls wild on her forehead, and a light breeze moves me to caress her long ear that is delicate as the skin over a girl's wrist. Suddenly, I realize that if I stepped out of my body, I would break into blossom. We're looking at Matthew 11 and the relationship between Jesus, the Messiah, and the expectations of the Messiah generated by John the Baptist. These expectations are echoed by Israel at large and are largely spelled out in Isaiah 61 in particular. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. The messianic hope was that one day a king would arise from the line of David and so restore the fortunes of the people. But first, let's step back and note a couple of things that the New Testament writers report Jesus doing and saying that impact upon those expectations. Interesting, what we note is that Jesus moves towards non-Jews, Gentiles. He eats and drinks with them rather than wreaking vengeance on them. We have a Jesus who doesn't come to spew fire and judgment, but to seek and save the lost. We have a Jesus who will come to judge, but this is a judgment on the prince of this world, not Gentiles, not Romans, not the local governing powers. It's judgment now by means of his death and resurrection. We have the King Jesus riding on a donkey to his inauguration. There's no hint here of nationalism. There's no re-establishment of the monarchy or a push for political power or even a prominent place for Jerusalem. Not only does the prophet, the King, the Messiah Jesus come, but he dies. Crucified, in fact. Oh, and just to freak out the disciples, he comes back to life. We have a crucified and a risen Messiah on the hand here. Paul himself argues that Jesus replaces the law as the center of the tradition. Circumcision, not eating unclean food, and the temple, all distinguishing features of Jewishness, fall by the wayside. This was not part of the imagined trajectory. The disciples and the New Testament writers are having to rethink their God, their faith, their scriptures in light of Jesus. To note the continuities and the discontinuities, the endings and the fulfillments. One of my favourite stories that Kirsty tells about her upbringing in Aberdeen is where she was walking home from school with a friend, and this friend is very keen to warn and instruct Kirsty about the hazards of dodgy-looking characters. In fact, she points at a shabbily dressed older man across the road. Him, for example, him. The man is alerted to their presence and actually suddenly changes direction and comes straight for them. Not only does he do that, he starts brandishing in his hand a wooden stick. Comes straight up to them. The friend stiffens. And at this point, Kirsty finally says something. "Hello, Dad." Now, let's come finally to John Baptist, he of the camel hair clothing and the locusts and honey diet. We're talking about expectations, about looks and content, about making judgments. John comes neither eating nor drinking, a wild-looking and sounding prophet in the wilderness, and they say he is a demon. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and they say, here's a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. By the way, you might want to just take in that quite striking picture by David LaChapelle on the slide, by the way. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come? Or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. And the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." So John has heard about his cousin Jesus' deeds and he has doubts. Are you the one? Maybe he's looking for reassurance regarding his life and his message of repentance and of fire, and about the one who's to come, of whom he said, he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. He's ready to separate the chaff from the wheat with his winnowing fork. Then he will clean up the threshing area, gathering the wheat into his barn, but burning the chaff with never-ending fire. Not only does Jesus point to his deeds, go back and report to John what you hear and see, but he also points to the well-known prophecy and the marks of the coming Messiah, which John would have recognized. Yet we note, crucially, that Jesus misses out something here. And what's missing here is the day of vengeance of our God. The judgment and fire which is core to John's message, he hasn't heard, and he's getting confirmation of this direct from Jesus. You see, the gist was an expectation that fire would fall on the Gentiles who did not follow Yahweh and who had overrun their land, destroyed their original temple, and removed their kings. And that fire would also fall upon the unfruitful within Israel also. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. John, it seems, is struggling with Jesus, with recognizing him as Messiah. Two things then seem to be a sticking point for him. Where is the fire? And what are you doing messing about with these Gentiles upon whom the fire is supposed to come? I don't recognize you. You're not what I expected. I'm a prophet, dressed like a prophet, talking about judgment. I've separated myself, yet you go the other way, eating with Gentiles, sinners, tax collectors, treating them as friends. John the Baptist is saying, Israel is saying, and has been saying, Jesus, you're not acting the way I expect you to, the way I want you to. We're playing the pipe, but you do not dance. We're singing a dirge, yet you do not mourn. Jesus is not playing to their tune. Now, John the Baptist is a turning point in salvation history, says Jesus, the bridge between the Old Testament and New Testament, between the time that is yet to come and the now Messiah time. cataclysmic event. The shift has finally happened. And while in line with prophecy, doesn't and won't look exactly as expected. So John is being invited to look beyond the form to the substance and fruit. Yes, Jesus is the Messiah, just not the kind of Messiah his generation expects. The story gives us an insight into the dynamics, the process of reimagining God in the light of the actions and words of Jesus. It's the question the first century Israel faced, given the Old Testament narrative, and that the disciples and New Testament writers faced too. And it's what we as modern day followers of Jesus face amidst our cultural and personal narratives and our reading of the Gospels too. The spiritual life is, among other things, about unlearning narratives. As the poets say, we grow through shedding. You need to be convinced first that Jesus is the way, and then reimagine God and the faith of old to account for it, which is to say, to read the moment, the Jesus moment, and adjust the tradition in light of it, says theologian Peter Enns. And this seems to be what is happening here. Malcolm, a couple of weeks ago, asked what forms our view of Jesus. And that's a myriad of things based on experiences, observations, disappointments and hope, dreams, images and conversations. So are there personal and corporate images and narratives that we hold that need re-examined? So that was them, there and then. Now we'll look at us, here and now. Yes, clearly there is a delight at Jesus' words and deeds in the Gospels. But can we hear the shock and the outrage at Jesus? Paul also uses the phrase stumbling block. Jews want miracles, Greeks wisdom, and I give you Christ crucified. A visual and obvious curse in the Jewish mindset. It's a substantial stumbling block, one that shocked and silenced, awes and confuses. Falling to the ground, blinded by a bright flash of light, Paul in Acts 9 asks, "Who are you, Lord?" Personally, I need reminding that God, the God whom Jesus is and reflects, is not a monolith, not a fixed idea or an abstraction, without character, volition, or personality, whose otherness and wildness, freedom, asks for vulnerability, suppleness of faith, of outlook, and of belief on my part. I don't think we are here merely to collect a set of correct beliefs about Jesus, protect them, be faithful to them until we die. I might mistake certainty and correct belief for faith when what God really desires is trust and intimacy. So I don't know if the idea of Jesus being a stumbling block seems anathema to you or outlandish to you. I may get an image or an idea of God in my head, be it from prayer, from conversation, from observation of the world or family events, a dream, or from reading the Bible, which is a very dangerous book. They can be jolting, disappointing, but also exhilarating. And they can expose a fixed view in me or an offense or open me up in a delightful way. I have sulked for a whole year when I thought God was treating me like a battery, just a workhorse for getting things done. And I've been undone by a dream. Jesus at a medieval fair. In a field amongst dwellings, I saw a wooden beam. At each end of this beam was a contestant, and one of them was Jesus. And they shuffled towards each other in what looked like a pillow fight. And you know what? Jesus was absolutely rubbish at it, and fell off repeatedly and laughed his head off each time. And something shifted in me. Did Jesus have to be perfect at everything? Was perfection his aim and expected of me too? No. Be perfect as I am perfect was reimagined in line with actually quite a few contemporary translations as be whole as I am whole. I also recall being jolted by Matthew 25. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. And it struck me right between the eyes that I've got it all wrong. For all these years, I haven't a clue. I've undervalued Jesus' identification with the poor and needy. It's actually the closest I've got to giving up on my faith. Maybe we've all misinterpreted signs, justified actions, had dreams that asked questions of what Jesus is really like, said prayers that haven't been answered, despaired at election results and global events like COVID or tsunamis, experienced church splits and wondered why God hasn't intervened. But maybe also not taken those questions honestly and humbly to God, reflecting on what they might tell us. There are signs of offense, of disappointment, when I hear myself saying certain phrases, and you might recognize some of these yourself. The first is this: I had thought. You might think of the disciples on the road to Emmaus coming back after the shock of Jesus' death. How can you? Think of the many times Jesus ate and drank with Gentiles, sinners, and caused such a stir. The third phrase, if only you had. Think of Martha at Lazarus' tomb. This seemed like an avoidable death. There's a story of a minister who went to visit a parishioner who hadn't been along for a while. And they were sitting in front of this coal fire. And one piece of coal fell from the pile and dribbled into the hearth. The orangeness of the coal dimmed. And after a while, the minister silently picked it up and put it back onto the coal pile. And then the parishioner turned to him and said, I'm coming back. So what do we do with offense? What do we do with disappointment, surprises in relation to God? I think we can think again. I think we can turn towards. We can question with honesty, humility, and curiosity. But also be reminded that in him we live and move and have our being. All of this is included. There's room for all of this. Jesus kindly, compassionately says to John, blessed are you if you're not offended by me. I've stumbled on account of Jesus, and I suspect I will again, not infrequently, perhaps. I've come to think of such changes or dynamics in terms of a very complicated technical scheme. And here it is. Slide 5, please. Eh? Oh, right. Yes. Incomprehension and disorientation. Are you the one? Oh, right. Awakening and recognition. Jesus says, be open to what you see and hear, to what you experience. And then yes, give consent and surrender. It's this last one I think I'm most drawn to. It's the most personal and seems the most respectful part of the falling, the deepening, the blossoming that follows our repeated yeses. In the experience of beauty, I awaken and surrender in the same act. I know a man, a God-man whose kindness is melting me. These are two beautiful descriptions of what's happening here from two poets. So in conclusion, blessed words, are they not? We live our lives before the wild, dangerous, unfettered, and free character of the living God. From the point of view of following Jesus, of growing in faith, respecting the otherness and wildness of God is, in my view, a good and necessary posture. Because surprises will come our way. God is too big. God is too deep. He's too wide and high to stay in our box. And B, I'm afraid we've got a tendency to make God in our own image, playing a tune where we want him to dance. So, out of respect for relationship and for the sake of receptivity, let us be vulnerable before our God and supple in our faith. Jesus gives us a God who is other and who is wild, who says, I am who I am, you are who you are, and I will respect you. Will you allow me to reach out to show you who I am, to give you who I am, that you might relax your grip, let down your self-protecting defenses, and blossom under my loving gaze. I know a man whose kindness is melting me. Okay, we've got a bit of time. Just maybe to register what has stirred or jolted within each of us and sit with it and possibly even reflect on it and share upon it. So can we have slide 6, please? So a couple of questions you might want to ponder. The first one is around, are you the one? Has there been a time when you've had a new revelation of Jesus and realized that your Jesus has been too small and that shift has happened? What was it? Second one is around, you didn't dance. Has there been a time you've taken offense at Jesus? How did this develop and resolve? And if that is for you now, then I'd like you to consider listening and receiving Jesus' words. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. So we're just going to give a couple of minutes silence and then open up the mic if anyone likes to share any of their own reflections.